It starts like any other morning until a white officer violently yanks a black woman's hair at the courthouse, treating her like she doesn't belong. But here's what he doesn't know. She's not a defendant, not a clerk. She's the presiding judge. And in just 3 minutes, she's going to walk into that courtroom, put on her robe, and expose not only him, but the entire system that's protected men like him for years. This isn't just about one act of racism, it's about years of silence, power, unchecked, and a woman who finally says, enough. What follows is a powerful reckoning, a courtroom twist, and a truth that can't be buried. Let us know where you're watching from, and what time you're tuning in. Drop it in the comments below. It started like any other morning, except it wasn't. Not really. There was something about the way the mist clung to the courthouse lawn that made everything feel suspended, like time had paused to take a breath before something irreversible happened. The fog sat low, hugging the sidewalk where the first fallen leaves of October had begun to gather in quiet corners. Althea Brooks stepped out of her parked sedan, without a sound, closing the door softly as if out of respect for the stillness around her. Her gray wool suit hugged her tall frame, crisp and clean like the woman herself, and the soft shine of her leather shoes caught the edge of the morning light as she climbed the stone steps one by one. She didn't carry power like a sword. She wore it like breath, subtle, constant, undeniable. Her natural hair coiled and full-framed her face with a quiet pride, as though every strand remembered where she came from. In her right hand she held a slim brown briefcase. In her left, nothing at all, no phone, no coffee, no signal to the world that she needed distraction. She didn't rush. She never did. That too was part of her presence, a quiet command that didn't need volume. That morning she was headed to work just like she had 100 times before. But something about the air felt different. Not heavy, not hostile, just watchful. Inside the building, the echo of her heels met polished floors and high ceilings stained by time. At the main entrance where visitors filtered through security, 2 guards stood behind the conveyor belt, watching people shuffle forward with bags, belts, and anxious glances. Deputy Troy Keller leaned against the scanner like he owned the place. His posture was wide, elbows out, hand resting on his radio like a promise he might keep if given the chance. Mid-40s, close-shaven head, thick neck, thick voice. The kind of man who carried his badge like a second skin and believed every rule he enforced was a favor. Althea moved forward calmly, her eyes scanning the room without hurry. Keller saw her before she saw him. She noticed the shift in his stance first, the way he straightened just slightly, then tilted his chin in that half-challenging, half-dismissive way. She had seen that posture before, not just in men like him, but in the institutions that built them. He raised a hand abruptly, palm facing her chest. "Ma'am," he said, dragging the word out like it tasted sour. "I need you to step out of line." She blinked once, the expression in her eyes unreadable but unwavering. "Is there an issue?" she asked, her voice low, firm even. Keller stepped forward, just close enough for her to smell the sour coffee on his breath. His eyes narrowed, skimming from her hair to her heels. "No visible ID. Can't let you through like that," he muttered, loud enough for others in the line to hear, but soft enough to deny intent. Althea reached slowly into her jacket and pulled out a federal badge, holding it with 2 fingers, clear and deliberate. "This should suffice," she said, extending it toward him without flinching. Keller didn't even glance at it. He took it, shoved it into his pocket, and looked past her shoulder like she no longer existed. Something in her jaw tensed, but only for a second. "I'd like that returned," she said, no louder than before. He smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. "You in a rush, sweetheart." The word hit her like an old bruise being pressed. Behind him, a young female officer, rookie by the look of her, watched with a kind of nervous stillness, like she knew something wasn't right, but hadn't learned what to do with that knowledge yet. "I need to get to the 4th floor, Althea said. "Courtroom 12. Keller took a step closer. His presence wasn't loud, but it was invasive, the kind that presses against your ribs even when no one's touching you. "Then you'll follow my procedure," he snapped. "Random check. Standard protocol. Come with me." She didn't move, not out of fear, but because she was thinking, measuring, weighing the consequences of compliance against the power of witnessing. Then she stepped forward, not because she agreed, but because she needed to see what he'd do next. He gripped her upper arm, not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to insult. The hallway he led her down was colder than the rest of the building, fluorescent lights humming like flies trapped in glass. They entered a side room, small, windowless, painted in the kind of beige that makes a place feel like it doesn't want to be remembered. There was a metal chair in the center, a desk in the corner, nothing else. Althea stopped at the threshold. "This is unnecessary," she said. "You have no legal cause." Keller didn't reply. He motioned toward the chair. "Sit." His tone was sharp now, performance grade. He wanted an audience, even if it was just the rookie officer still frozen by the door. When Althea didn't move, he stepped behind her and reached, and then with one swift, calculated motion, he yanked her hair back. Her head snapped, breath caught, but she didn't scream. Her eyes burned, but not from pain, from fury held in place by every year she'd had to practice this restraint. She stumbled but didn't fall. "Get your hands off me," she said through clenched teeth. He let go, chuckling under his breath. "You people get so sensitive about everything." The room held a silence so thick it felt alive. The rookie officer looked away. Keller adjusted his belt like nothing had happened. "You're free to go," he said, tossing her badge onto the table like it was a receipt. "4th floor's that way." Althea didn't reply. She walked over, picked up her badge, brushed a strand of hair from her face and turned. Her shoulders were still square, her gait still deliberate, but something in the air had shifted. She was no longer walking into a courtroom. She was walking into a reckoning. The moment she stepped back into the main hallway, the noise of the courthouse returned like a slow tidal wave, heels tapping over polished floors, printers whirring behind glass doors, voices rising and fading like the churn of a well-oiled machine that didn't pause for indignity. No one looked twice at her as she walked past. No one noticed the tremor in her hands or the way she touched her scalp for just a moment, checking for strands that no longer sat the way they had an hour ago. The air smelled like old paper and freshly brewed coffee, but none of it felt familiar anymore. It was the same building, but not the same day, and certainly not the same Althea. She moved through the crowd like a ghost. No one could see elevators opening, legal aides laughing in corners, secretaries walking briskly with clipboards, but no one stopped her. No one saw what had been done. That was the part that stayed with her, the casual invisibility. If someone had yelled, if someone had intervened, if even one person had said, "Hey, are you okay?" the day might have tilted differently. But no, silence was the true badge in this place. It hung heavier than any uniform, and it weighed most on those who had learned to wear it just to survive. Inside the elevator, she stood facing the doors, jaw-set fingers curled tight around the leather handle of her case. Her reflection in the mirrored panel stared back, composed but different. One coil of hair was still out of place where Keller had yanked it, and she didn't tuck it behind her ear. She left it, let it sit there wild and unresolved. The elevator dinged, and as the doors opened to the 4th floor, a breeze of air conditioning met her face, too cold, too sterile, like the apology that never came. She stepped out and turned left, passing law clerks and young attorneys who nodded respectfully, not realizing the storm that had passed just below her skin. The walk to her chambers took 20 silent steps, each one echoing louder than the last. She didn't speak to her clerk, didn't check her email, didn't bother with the robe that waited neatly folded like armor behind glass. She walked straight to the private washroom, locked the door behind her, and stared into the mirror. What stared back wasn't broken, it was boiling. She pressed both palms against the sink, leaned in close, and exhaled slowly through her nose. "Don't give them this," she whispered to her reflection, but the words didn't hold much weight. Her scalp still stung. Her pride still bled. And behind all that, deeper than anger, something colder, sat waiting calculation. Because now, she had a choice. She could go through the motions, run court, as scheduled, act like nothing had happened, like every woman before her who had been insulted and told to be professional. Or she could do something else, something that made them remember her not as the woman who was humiliated, but as the judge who remembered every face that laughed while it happened. She left the washroom without adjusting her hair. She didn't need to. Let them see it. Let them try to make sense of it when she walked into the courtroom as if the morning never occurred. Let their own silence reflect back at them. In the hallway, her assistant, a young man in a blue tie, looked up nervously. "Judge Brooks, they're prepping courtroom 12. Press is already seated. Full docket this morning." She nodded once. "Don't change anything," she said. "Let them wait. I'll enter from the main floor, not chambers." He blinked. "You sure?" She looked him in the eye. "Absolutely." As she moved down the corridor, every fluorescent bulb seemed to buzz a little louder. Every footstep felt sharper against marble tile. The courthouse wasn't hostile, it was indifferent. That was worse. It wasn't that they wanted her gone. It was that they didn't care what happened to her at all. But that was about to change. She passed a group of law interns standing near the stairwell. One of them, a young black woman with nervous hands and pressed slacks, who gave her a timid smile. Althea met her gaze, didn't smile back, but nodded slow, deliberate. The kind of nod that says, "Yes, I see you, I've been you, and you will be me someday if we make it through this." As she turned the corner toward courtroom 12, the muffled sound of voices seeped through the heavy oak doors, attorneys murmuring, reporters whispering, the faint clicks of camera lenses being focused. None of them knew what had just happened. None of them had felt the weight of a white man's fist buried in their hair like an accusation. But they were about to learn what justice looked like when it walked in carrying its wounds like weapons. She paused, one hand on the brass handle, and let herself feel the fire one last time before the door opened. Not to burn, but to remember. Because when the truth finally rises, it doesn't shout. It walks in quietly and commands the room. Courtroom 12 wasn't just full, it was humming. The kind of hum you only hear when too many people try to whisper at once, when tension floats in the air like static before a storm breaks. Journalists lined the back rows with notebooks, half open, and phones recording quietly in their laps, while attorneys adjusted their ties and straightened their jackets, unsure what exactly they were bracing for. The central aisle was clear, lit from above by a narrow skylight that poured pale morning light onto the polished floor like a spotlight meant for someone who hadn't arrived yet. No one looked toward the double doors. Everyone assumed Judge Althea Brooks would appear from the private chambers like she always did. Calm, formal, protected by tradition and protocol. Everyone was wrong. The moment the doors creaked open from the main floor, the room shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. But the sound of her heels, those same soft leather heels clicking against the stone, drew every head around like a compass pulled by magnetic truth. She walked alone, without a clerk, without a robe, without even a glance to the crowd, and yet no one could look away. The bruised strand of hair on her temple was still there, defiant, unresolved, and somehow more powerful than any gavel. No one said a word. The silence was absolute. Even the lawyers stopped flipping pages. Even the camera lenses paused, holding their breath between shutter clicks. She passed the defense table without slowing, passed the prosecution with equal disregard, and when she reached the steps of the bench, she stopped not to take it, not yet, but to look up. Her eyes scanned the gallery like a lens. She didn't seek approval, didn't demand sympathy. She simply looked, and in that look, every person in that courtroom saw something they hadn't been prepared to witness: a black woman standing, not in defiance, but in absolute, unflinching ownership. Behind the bench, folded neatly over the arm of her chair, her black robe waited. She reached for it slowly with the kind of grace that turns cloth into symbol. One arm, then the other. The fabric slid over her shoulders like armor returning to its rightful frame. She didn't ask for help. She didn't wait for the bailiff. And when she turned to face the court, fully robed, fully herself, the room felt smaller, like the truth had just walked in and dared everyone to blink. The same bailiff from earlier, Deputy Troy Keller, stood frozen near the side entrance, his posture stiff and his face slowly draining of color. He didn't speak. He didn't move. For the first time that day, perhaps the first time in years, he looked like a man completely out of control. Althea didn't address him, not yet. Instead, she turned to the court clerk, who had already risen from her seat. "Is the docket ready?" Althea asked, her voice steady, formal, clear. The clerk nodded, fumbling slightly with the papers in her hands. "Yes, Your Honor." "Then let's proceed," Althea said, lowering herself into the chair as if no part of her body ached, as if the morning's assault hadn't left a mark, but it had. It left something deeper than bruises, an invisible heat behind her ribs, a fire carried not in rage but in restraint. She glanced to the counsel tables. "We will begin with preliminary testimony in Case 1831C, the matter of Charles versus City of Mapleton Police Department." Murmurs shifted across the courtroom like a breeze, people remembering why they were there before they realized they'd just witnessed something far more important than anyone hearing. Althea's voice, as she recited the charges, excessive force, abuse of power, civil rights violations, cut cleanly through the room. Not loud, not emotional, just precise, the way truth is when it stops apologizing. Her eyes never strayed to Keller, though she could feel his presence like a shadow trying to retreat. She didn't need to look at him yet. The longer she waited, the smaller he became. Power, real power, didn't need to announce itself. It just sat down and expected the world to adjust. The first witness was called a young black father, whose teenage son had been tackled during a peaceful protest and left with a fractured shoulder and permanent nerve damage. As he took the stand, his voice shook, not from weakness, but from the memory of begging for help, while officers laughed. Althea listened, every muscle, still every note taken with care. When he finished, he looked toward her, not as a judge, not even as a symbol, but as someone who might finally listen. She nodded once. "Thank you for your testimony. You've been heard." When the courtroom recessed, no one moved quickly. People lingered, half afraid that if they looked away, this moment might vanish. But Althea stayed seated, unmoved, her fingers laced gently on the desk. The robe draped over her like quiet thunder, and outside the chamber doors someone whispered, "That's not a judge, that's a reckoning." They weren't wrong. Because on that morning in that courtroom, justice didn't enter in silence or in rage. She entered through the front door. And she brought the truth with her. The courtroom settled into a strange quiet after the first witness stepped down, one of those silences that doesn't feel like peace, but more like a breath being held. Even the air seemed heavier, like the building itself knew something was about to shift. Judge Althea Brooks didn't move. She sat behind the bench, elbows resting lightly on the armrests, eyes level and sharp, watching the space in front of her, as if it were a stage, and she already knew what the next act would reveal. The attorneys murmured at their tables, leafing through paperwork as a kind of nervous ritual. But her focus wasn't on them. Not yet. It was on the shadow near the back of the room, the one trying to make itself smaller by the second. Deputy Troy Keller hadn't spoken a word since court began. He remained near the exit jaw, clenched arms crossed too tightly over his chest. But Althea could see the tension in his legs, the restless shift in his stance, the shallow rise and fall of breath, trying not to betray panic. His face, once smug and dismissive, now looked pale beneath the artificial lights. She waited a beat longer, long enough to let the stillness hum through the gallery like a warning, and then she spoke, her voice cutting through the quiet like glass. "Deputy Keller," she said calmly, not raising her tone, not offering him a title he hadn't earned. "Please approach the bench." The entire room seemed to exhale at once, heads turning back, straightening papers, pausing mid-flip. Keller blinked, stunned. For a second he didn't move, as if the words had landed in a language he didn't speak. Then, like a man sleepwalking toward his own undoing, he stepped forward slowly, each footfall echoing just a little louder than it should have. "State your full name for the record," Althea instructed, her eyes locked on him without the slightest flicker of warmth. He swallowed, barely audible. "Troy Michael Keller. And your position in this courthouse?" "Deputy Bailiff, ma'am, Your Honor." 14 years. His voice cracked mid-sentence. She leaned forward slightly, not to intimidate, but to look him squarely in the eye. "In those 14 years, how many women have you escorted into that side room for random checks?" Keller blinked again. I don't have that number, Your Honor." "I do," she replied. 9 official complaints, all filed by women of color, all dismissed." He opened his mouth, then closed it again, searching for an answer that wouldn't exist. Her voice didn't rise, but the precision in it carried like a bell through the room. "You didn't ask my name. You didn't look at my credentials. You saw a black woman walking into a federal courthouse and decided that meant she didn't belong." Someone in the gallery gasped quietly, involuntarily. Keller's hands twitched at his sides, fingers opening and closing, as if trying to grasp something already lost. "You humiliated me, not just as a citizen or as a woman, but as a human being. And you did it with ease because no one ever told you there would be consequences." Keller shook his head faintly. "I didn't know who you were, and that's exactly the problem," she replied. "You treated me the way you've treated countless others, not because of who I was, but because of what you assumed I wasn't." There was no need for shouting. No need for gavel banging. The weight of her words settled in the room like dust, finally allowed to fall after years suspended. Althea turned to her clerk without breaking eye contact. "Place Deputy Keller under administrative detainment pending formal investigation." 2 officers rose without hesitation. The sound of handcuffs snapping open felt louder than thunder. Keller flinched, taking a half-step back, but didn't resist. He looked around the room, maybe for help, maybe for sympathy, but found neither. As the officers led him away, one woman near the back of the gallery began to weep softly, not out of grief, but out of release. The door closed behind him with a firm click, and in that moment, something invisible seemed to lift from the room. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't vengeance. It was the faint sound of dignity returning 1 inch at a time. Althea remained seated still and composed, but her fingers gripped the edge of the bench just slightly harder than before. Not out of anger, but to keep from trembling, not from weakness, but from the memory of how close she'd come to letting silence win. She cleared her throat gently and turned back to the courtroom. "We will resume testimony in 10 minutes, she said. "Recess is granted." As people stood, they didn't rush for the exits. Instead, they moved slowly, glancing back toward the bench, as if they didn't want to leave whatever had just happened behind. One by one, quiet nods met her gaze: an old man with a cane, a law student in a wrinkled suit, a young mother holding a toddler on her lap. They didn't speak, but their eyes said what words could not. "Thank you. We've been waiting a long time for someone like you to show up." And in that small, flickering moment, amid the cold lights and worn pews of a courthouse that had forgotten how to see Althea Brooks, remembered exactly why she had ever chosen to sit in that chair. Not for authority, not for recognition, but because sometimes the only way to rebuild justice is to begin with the truth spoken plainly, calmly, and without apology. By the time Althea returned to her chambers that afternoon, the light had changed. The sun, once bright and clinical through the upper windows, had shifted to a warmer, more slanted glow that cast long shadows across the bookshelves and floor. The courthouse had quieted some, but not entirely. She could still hear the muted shuffle of shoes outside her door, the occasional tap of a keyboard from the clerk's desk nearby, and the low hum of the air conditioner cycling on and off with a breath-like rhythm. The walls held on to the echo of what had just happened. A man in uniform led away in cuffs, not because of one mistake, but because of years of protected misconduct finally exposed in public. Althea stood for a long moment just inside the room, one hand still on the doorframe, letting the silence settle before she moved. Her robe hung heavy on her shoulders, now not with fatigue but with a different weight, the realization that her authority had never really shielded her. It had only made her survival more fragile. She crossed to her desk, pulled out the leather chair, and sat slowly, her hands resting gently over the unopened manila folder that had been placed there while she was in session. No note, no message, just her name typed neatly on the tab and a string of numbers scribbled in pencil along the top edge, R09 through R21. She opened it. Inside were complaint forms, dozens of them. Some typed, some handwritten, a few with attached photographs or witness statements. Each one detailed incidents involving Deputy Troy Keller going back nearly 10 years. Althea flipped through them, quietly absorbing line after line like silent confessions. Women, black women, Latina women, younger women described being searched, unnecessarily verbally harassed, pulled aside for security, and left feeling afraid, violated, small. A pattern, clear as daylight. Each report had been signed off as resolved by courthouse administration, including her former mentor, Judge Gregory Wexler. Her breath caught when she saw his signature, neat, confident, the same she remembered from the bottom of her clerkship recommendation letter 15 years earlier. The man who once told her she had the discipline for high court and the face for press had also, without hesitation, buried complaint after complaint, all to preserve the illusion of order. One memo stood out more than the others, a direct communication between Wexler and courthouse security. It read, "Keller's assertiveness is unpleasant but effective, especially with difficult types. Let's not escalate unless media gets involved." She read it twice, then closed the folder gently and laid both hands on top. The room was still. But inside her chest, something had cracked. There was a soft knock. Her clerk stepped in, voice cautious. "Judge Brooks, there's a request from the Office of Inspector General. They're asking for any documentation on past internal complaints tied to Keller. Should I forward this folder?" Althea looked up. "Yes. And tell them to request a full audit of courthouse complaint handling over the last 2 decades. Herr Clerk hesitated. "Including," she finished the sentence for her, "including every judge who signed those dismissals. No exclusions. Start with Wexler. Then work your way down." He nodded, lips pressed into a thin line, then stepped out. The door clicked shut again, sealing the room once more in its peculiar quiet. Althea took off her robe, and laid it carefully across the back of her chair. It looked different now, less like protection, and more like a flag. She walked to the window and stared out at the side courtyard, where golden leaves swirled in small circles near the bench, where she used to eat lunch as a clerk, back when she still believed that hard work alone could beat everything else. A buzz broke her thought. Her phone lit up with a new message. Justice Committee requests urgent call today's detainment. Senate may initiate inquiry. She didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, she pulled out a notepad and began drafting something she'd only imagined until today: a courthouse policy reform. Plan 1 that would require anti-bias training, independent misconduct review boards, and mandatory public transparency reports. No more sealed files. No more vanishing complaints. She titled it The Brooks Doctrine. Not because she wanted her name on it, but because the system needed a name to answer for what it had allowed. Outside, the sky was turning copper. Long shadows stretched across the courthouse steps, where a few people now gathered, not protesters, not reporters, just citizens. Some stood alone. Others held signs that said, "Accountability now," or "Protect Black Women." A teenage girl in a denim jacket sat on the stone railing, watching the windows above. When she caught sight of Althea's silhouette, she didn't wave. She just nodded, small but firm, like she was saying, "I see you. I get it. I'm learning from this." And in that simple gesture, Althea felt something shift. Not the burden, not the past, but the balance of what came next. Because the robe was no longer just hers to wear. It was a statement, a warning, a promise. And she intended to keep it. The final morning arrived with a sky so gray it looked like it hadn't made up its mind to rain or break apart into light. The courthouse loomed ahead, quiet but watchful, its windows reflecting a restless kind of stillness that didn't belong to any ordinary Tuesday. Althea Brooks stood just outside the doors, one hand resting on the steel rail, her breath catching in her throat for just a moment, not out of fear but out of clarity. Everything that needed to happen was already set in motion. There was no more hiding, no more folding the truth down into softer, safer pieces. Today wasn't about punishment. Today was about what came after the mask of order was ripped away. Inside, the courtroom was already full, not with noise but with presence. People sat shoulder to shoulder, activists, lawyers, interns, clerks retired, judges, young students, mothers with babies, and old men in Sunday hats, all waiting to see whether justice could truly carry its own name without apology. The lighting had shifted again, soft but clear, with no shadows left to hide in. Althea stepped through the doors, not in a rush, not with ceremony, but with that steady rhythm that had always been hers. Her robe flowed lightly behind her like a quiet current, and the sound of her heels made the rows rise to their feet, not because they were told to, but because they knew. She paused at the bench, placed a leather-bound folder gently on the wood, and looked out across the gallery. Her eyes moved from face to face, not scanning for approval, but acknowledging that they were still here, still listening, still refusing to look away. When she sat, it was like a seal closing on something irreversible. She tapped her gavel once, then spoke, her voice low and direct. "This court is now in session." At the side door, 2 federal officers opened the entrance to the holding corridor. Deputy Troy Keller entered, flanked and cuffed, no longer in uniform, no longer armed, no longer hiding behind a badge he had treated like a weapon. His face was pale, sunken, as if the weight of the past week had aged him beyond his years. He didn't speak. He didn't make eye contact. He just stood beside the defense table, hands in front wrists, bound by the same cold metal he'd once used on others without second thought. Althea didn't look at him first. She looked at the folder in front of her and opened it carefully, revealing the findings of the investigation, the complaints, the cover-ups, the signatures, the silence that had made it all possible. She didn't need to read them out loud. Everyone in the room already knew. She lifted her head. "Mr. Keller," she began, her tone neither angry nor cold but unflinching. "This court finds you guilty on all charges: abuse of power, violation of civil rights, and obstruction of justice." There was no gasp, no applause. Only breath held and released like a building remembering how to exhale. "For these crimes, you are hereby sentenced to 12 years in federal custody without the possibility of parole for the first 7. You will be transferred to a facility designated by the U.S. Marshals Service, and you will not be placed in general population for the duration of your intake period." He didn't flinch. But something in his posture sagged like a thread pulled loose from a knot that had held too tightly for too long. Althea paused, then continued, softer but sharper. "But beyond the legal sentence there is a human reckoning. For every woman you demeaned, every voice you dismissed, every silence you built into this system, you now stand in the seat you once filled with fear. You no longer decide who deserves dignity. That power is no longer yours. She tapped the gavel again, and the officers moved forward without a word. Keller was escorted out each step heavy, not from the cuffs but from the weight of being seen for the first time, not as the enforcer but as the accused. The door closed behind him, and again the room did not move. It simply held the moment like a fragile truth too long unspoken. Then Althea turned to the gallery. "Let the record reflect," she said, "that this court does not serve order at the expense of truth. It does not protect tradition when tradition becomes a shield for cruelty. What happened in this courtroom is not an exception. It is an unveiling." She opened a second folder, lifted a document, and held it in the air. "This is the Monroe Doctrine," she said. "Effective immediately, every courthouse staff member in this district will be subject to mandatory anti-bias training, quarterly misconduct audits, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior." A stir moved through the seats like wind through tall grass. Not outrage, not disbelief, but recognition, like the first time someone dares to say the thing you've been whispering in the dark for years. "This isn't about revenge," she continued, her voice quieter now. "It's about responsibility, about rebuilding something that never should have been broken. If justice is real, it cannot be blind to harm or deaf to history." She paused, looking down at her robe, her hands resting atop it like bookends to everything this job had ever meant. When the gavel struck one final time, no one clapped. They stood again, not out of duty, not for tradition, but because the truth had filled the room and left them no choice but to rise with it. Outside, the clouds had finally parted, and a single shaft of light broke through onto the courthouse steps, where a crowd waited not for a verdict, but for proof that justice could look like them. And today it did. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a courtroom or a badge or even a robe. It was about a woman who refused to shrink even when the system tried to humiliate her into silence. Judge Althea Brooks didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. She reminded us that dignity is not something granted by uniforms or titles, but something we carry quietly until the moment the world is forced to see it. For many watching, especially those who've lived long enough to know what it feels like to be overlooked, dismissed, or told to wait your turn, this story speaks directly to you. It's a reminder that accountability is not too much to ask, that silence is not neutrality, and that justice, real justice, is not about revenge but about truth spoken out loud even when it shakes the walls. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of why we must keep standing tall even when we're tired, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Not just for the algorithm, but so more people can hear stories that matter, that challenge us, and that give voice to those who've been quiet for too long. Because sometimes the most powerful gavel is the one we carry in our hearts. Thank you for watching.